Well, it's just over 48 hours from being back from the Good News Autumn Camp. What have we got to show for it? I've got 2 bags of leftover food I liberated from the coach. At least 5 loads of laundry have been done in our house alone. Our pastor has gone down with some yucky lurgy, and I've picked up a bit of a cough myself. And of course, we've left our mark on Brynner Groys. A damaged wardrobe, a broken curtain rail, and those are only the things that have come to light thus far. And of course, there are the memories, wide game, activities of all kinds, swimming, high ropes, a talent show, news and nonsense, a bonfire, and so on. And of course, there was the teaching. Let's not forget that. Epilogues and discussions and Bible studies and gospel meetings. And over 4 meetings, we looked at the book of Jonah. Dave Cox from Nelson was the chaplain. He led those things. And then the 3 Bible studies were an occasion to discuss the things that had been taught. Tonight, I want us to look at the book of Jonah. Specifically, I really just want our text to be those words at the end of verse 9. Salvation is of the Lord. Now, I want to focus on those 5 words in the light of the whole book. But those are the words, really, I want you to leave this place with those words ringing in your ears. As we begin looking at this verse, salvation is of the Lord, I want to consider who says it. When is it said? Where is it said? Why is it said? What does it mean? And what happens next? So, salvation is of the Lord. Who says it? You know the answer. These are the concluding words of Jonah's prayer in chapter 2. Jonah, the son of Amittai, is from the village of Gath-hepher, a place mentioned in 2 Kings chapter 14, verse 25. Now, the chronological setting is not in the book of Jonah specifically determined. It doesn't tell us which king it's in the reign of or anything like this, but it seems that when Jonah writes, when these words are recorded, the kingdom of Israel still exists. Now, remember, when the people of Israel, the children of Israel, come into the land of Canaan to begin with, about 1400 BC, they're one people. They're in their individual tribes and so on, but they're by and large one people. There's the time of the judges, and then there's the time of the kings of the united Israel. First there's Saul, then there's David, and then there's Solomon, and then there's Rehoboam. But it's under Rehoboam that kingdom fractures, and then we have the southern kingdom of Judah in the south, and that continues under the reign of the line of David, and you have the kingdom of Israel in the north, the separated 9 or 10 tribes up there under the reign of breakaway kings. Jonah, who's from Gath-hepher, which is in the north, is part of the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel. They're still the people of God, but generally they are a less faithful people than the kingdom of Judah. They are cut off from right worship and sacrifice in the temple in Jerusalem in the south. And yet, although they are further from the temple, the place of worship and right sacrifice and so on, God has still blessed the northern kingdom to some extent. In the reign of Jeroboam II, probably 786 to 746 BC, God sends his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai, the prophet, to speak of the restoring of some of Israel's territory because of his compassion towards his suffering people. Though the people in the north, they have not walked in close faithfulness to him, God blesses them anyway. And Jonah is an active participant in speaking of Yahweh's blessing. So, when are these words spoken? Salvation is of the Lord. Well, it seems we're in the 8th century BC, probably before 722 BC, because that's the year when Samaria, of which Nineveh was then the capital, in 722 BC, Samaria invades the northern kingdom Israel and takes the people away into captivity. So, it seems likely that this Joseph son of Amittai, from the village of Gath-hepher in the north. He has been a faithful servant of Yahweh. He has been used to speak words from him to his own covenant people about undeserved blessing and rescue. As a matter of fact, I've missed out a reading. I should have had a reading from Matthew chapter 12. If we'd had that reading, we'd have read these words by Jesus. Matthew 12, as he is speaking to the Pharisees and scribes who demand a sign, Jesus says to them, an evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh will rise up in the judgment with this generation and condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and indeed a greater than Jonah is here. The queen of the south will rise up in the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and indeed a greater than Solomon is here. In that reading, which I made a note of, and I wasn't following my notes, there we are, Jesus speaks of a greater than Jonah and a greater than Solomon. Now, for those words actually to have any impact, it implies that to the Jews of Jesus's day, they would already think highly of Jonah and Solomon. If they thought nothing of Jonah, and Jesus said, well, one greater than Jonah is here, they said, well, why does that matter? But if Jonah's quite well thought of by the Jews of Jesus's day, when Jesus says there is one greater than Jonah here, he is speaking of a position of significance and respect already for Jonah. So the Jonah who's speaking in Jonah 2, verse 9, he is no novice preacher. Rather, it seems he is an experienced prophet. In fact, if you look at the whole prayer of chapter 2, it seems to point to his knowledge and his experience. Almost every verse in chapter 2 seems to be a quotation of or allusion to a particular psalm. You may have seen some similarity already between some of those verses and our call to worship from Psalm 69. If you just keep your eyes on Jonah 2, as I read some verses from the psalm, look at Jonah chapter 2 while I read from Psalm 120. In my distress I cried unto the Lord, and he heard me. As you look at verse 3, I'll read from Psalm 88. I am as a man that hath no strength, free among the dead, like the slain that lie in the grave, whom thou rememberest no more, and they are cut off from thy hand. Thou hast laid me in the lowest pit, in darkness in the deeps. Thy wrath lieth hard upon me, and thou hast afflicted me with all thy waves. If you look at verse 4, I shall read to you from Psalm 31. For I said in my haste, I am cut off from before thine eyes. Nevertheless, thou heardest the voice of my supplications when I cried unto thee. Keep looking at verse 4 as I read from Psalm 5. But as for me, I will come into thy house in the multitude of thy mercy, and in thy fear will I worship toward thy holy temple. As you look at verse 5 of Jonah 2, I'll turn to Psalm 42. All thy waves and thy billows are gone over me. As you look at verse 6 of Jonah 2, I'll turn to Psalm 16. For thou wilt not leave my soul in hell, Sheol, the pit, the place of the dead, and so on. You get the idea. Every verse of Jonah 2 is clearly influenced by the Psalms. So Jonah is a man of the word. He's a man mightily used of God, a prophetic teaching servant of Yahweh. Now, specifically, when is salvation is of the Lord said? Not just 760 BC or something like that. Well, it comes at the end of his prayer, doesn't it? And verse 1 of chapter 2 says, Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the fish's belly. Then, after what? Well, the previous verse, chapter 1, verse 17, after Jonah has been in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. And so that also touches on the question, where is it said? We're in darkness when Jonah prays these words. He's inside an aquatic creature. The Hebrew says a great fish, but that's not specific scientific language. Perhaps it's a whale, perhaps it's a shark, perhaps it's a unique creation of God for just this occasion. Perhaps it's some large fish that's now extinct, but contains some kind of air sac that allowed a man to live there for a few days. But the point is, whatever it was, Jonah was there for 3 days and 3 nights before the words of chapter 2. For all of that time, Jonah has been amidst the weeds in the depths of the ocean. He has been removed from the land of the living. He has been cut off from the light of the sun. No one has seen Jonah or heard from him in that time. He's as good as dead. Indeed, there are those commentators who feel that the language used indicates Jonah even actually literally died in that time and is now resurrected in the belly of this sea creature. Now, his death and then being brought back to life might explain 3 days of silence until he speaks in chapter 2. Or perhaps Jonah has been conscious this whole time, claustrophobically trapped in darkness and filth with the stink of stomach acids and constant movement of peristalsis all around him. The environment he's in is the stuff of nightmares, of despair, of darkness. Well, how did he get there? Whatever did he wear way down in the middle of the ocean? Jonah's there for 3 reasons. Chapter 2, verse 3 says, as Jonah prays, he says to God, "You cast me into the deep." It's God's hand that has brought him to this place. In chapter 1, verse 15, we read of the Phoenician sailors. They picked up Jonah and threw him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Men's hands picked him up and threw him into the depths of a raging hurricane. God's cast him there, and Phoenician sailors have thrown him there. But there's also a sense where Jonah has specially made his own choices that brought him there. His running from what God has commanded has been a continued, consistent journey of descent. In Jonah 1, verse 2, he's told to arise to go up to Nineveh, but he only arose to, in verse 3, go down to Joppa. And then he goes down to a ship in the harbor there. And then he goes down into the lowest parts of the ship in verse 5 of chapter 1. And then he goes down into the depths of sleep. He has chosen to descend. He has been striving to flee from the presence of the Lord. Jonah chapter 2, verse 4 implies he's achieved his goal. I have been cast out of your sight. But this apparent escape from God, it's not into unfettered freedom, but into unparalleled fiasco in the darkness and vileness of an aquatic stomach. Running from God has brought him no blessing. Rather, it has only brought him to the gates of the grave itself. But why is, our text said, salvation is of the Lord? It's the conclusion of a prayer of a man who has stopped running, a man who has turned again to the right path. Even in chapter 2, after 3 days and nights of the most horrific situation, while he is still in bile and bleakness and blackness, Jonah speaks of hope and salvation. He doesn't say salvation will be of the Lord. No, now he is speaking of hope and rescue. Now he is rejoicing in being heard and answered. Now he is speaking of his life being brought back from the pit. Now he speaks of the salvation of the Lord. This word that's translated here as salvation, it's a Hebrew word that's used 77 times in the Old Testament. Most of the times in the Authorized Version, it's translated salvation. 4 times it's translated help. 3 times it's translated deliverance, 3 times it's translated health, and once each it's used for the words save or saving or welfare. And this Hebrew word has an idea of salvation, of deliverance. It implies welfare, of prosperity and victory. Now, we may have friends who are influenced by the prosperity gospel, and they might teach that the Christian believer should always be prosperous and healthy, both in their body and in their mind. And certainly God does often bless his people in various ways. But I urge you to consider Jonah. In darkness and in gloom, with no light of day or promise of rescue in his immediate situation, he speaks of the salvation of God. Already he is rejoicing in what God has provided him. This is not a rejoicing in outward prosperity, in the things that last for a short time in this world. Rather, it is delighting in what God has provided in some other way. A rescue from the pit, from the grave, from hell itself, and a fresh opportunity to worship. Though he was brought down, and ultimately he brought himself down, Jonah sees a lifting again, because salvation is of the Lord. It is the salvation of God that lifts his people on high once again. Salvation is not primarily about lifting from poverty or a bed of sickness or from low mental feelings. It is about being lifted up into relationship with God and delighting in his presence. In your life, you may have saved someone in a hospital setting. You've done the thing needed to stop them from dying. You may have counseled a suicidal friend and said the right thing at the right time. You may have pushed someone out of imminent danger. But this kind of salvation from the pit of death itself, that's something that is only possible for God to do. Salvation is of the Lord, first and last. Jonah speaks these words, but he himself knows a measure of restoration to God. He was running from God's presence. Now, remember, Jonah's no fool. He's a knowledgeable Old Testament believer. In chapter 1, verse 9, he spoke of fearing the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. Jonah would have known that literally escaping the all-seeing eyes of God was impossible. But in his running, perhaps he was hoping to escape at least the things that reminded him of God, the people of God, the language of God, the land of God. But though Jonah ran, God did not let him go. In our prayer time before the service, Phil read to us from Psalm 23. I brought out the idea of God's goodness and mercy that follow his sheep all the days of their life. God comforts and protects his sheep with the rod and the staff. And the rod and the staff, whilst we can't perhaps be too specific, sometimes God is using those things to defend his sheep from their enemies. Sometimes he uses those things even to defend us from ourselves. Here, Jonah has been so foolish. He has walked so far from where he should be. He has sunk down so deep. But he is not beyond the reach of the God who saves, because salvation is of the Lord. Where is Jonah looking? Both in verse 7 and in verse 4. He's looking towards God's holy temple. He's looking to the place of sacrifice, the place where atonement can be made. That is his confidence, that God will provide atonement, that God will provide restoration. Though he is running, God brings him back. Though he was resistant for all of chapter 1, he is now repentant. Truly, salvation is of the Lord. And yet, that fact of salvation is true for others also. Jonah knew better. He was an experienced servant of God. He was a great prophet from Gath-Hepher in the north of Israel, and he ran from his duty and his calling. Why? Was it cowardice? I don't think so. That's not what jumps out at me as you read through the whole book of Jonah. In chapter 1, verse 12, Jonah speaks, apparently stoically, of the need for his own sacrifice for the storm to cease. In chapter 1, verse 9, we hear the confession of Jonah. But though it seems good in content, I'm a Hebrew and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land, you don't get the feeling that he really means it. He's wickedly disobeyed God. As a result, Jonah has faced chastising from the hand of a loving father until finally he's restored in chapter 3, verse 1, with a fresh call to minister. What happens because of Jonah's wicked rebellion? As a result of Jonah running from God, Captain Hiram, I've made up the names, Captain Hiram of the Phoenician boat that was doing that 2,000-mile stretch from Joppa to Tarshish, well, he's had another paying customer. There's more money in his pocket. Now, Captain Hiram and his crew were polytheists. They each had their own tribal gods. And he knew little, if anything, of the God of Israel, the maker of all things, the God that his forefathers must once at least have worshipped, going back to the time of the sons of Noah. An experienced sailor, Captain Hiram, was terrified by the storm that seemed to have been hurled down upon the sea as they sailed. He was a businessman. He was out to make profit, but he's had to abandon all of his cargo overboard just in the hope of surviving the storm so that he might see tomorrow and a fresh chance of making profit. Like all the other sailors on the boat, Captain Hiram called out to his own God for deliverance and rescue, but he's wondering which local god might be responsible for this turbulent hurricane. And finally, as he goes down to look for Jonah or to find more cargo to throw overboard, and he finds Jonah sleeping in the hold, he says to Jonah that he should call upon his God. Perhaps this God is the local one who's needed to change things. And then as they draw lots in the sovereignty of God, the God who hurled the storm upon the sea, the lot falls on Jonah when the sailors are trying to determine the cause of their chaos. And when Jonah explains to them that he is a Hebrew who allegedly fears the Lord God who made all things, it doesn't say the sailors are afraid anymore. Now it says they're exceedingly afraid. They recognize they're not up against mere material elements. They recognize the true God of all things is opposed to them. And, well, to throw Jonah overboard, to destroy his servant seems foolish. But when this runaway prophet tells them that that's what they must do, they do so reluctantly, whilst crying out to this God for compassion and mercy. At the ceasing of the storm and the stilling of the waves, these men see the evident hand of a sovereign God. And now they fear him exceedingly. They feared the storm, but they exceedingly fear now this God who is evident. They sacrifice, and they vow vows. These men are transformed, delivered, saved in some sense. To my mind, we can arm wrestle afterwards if you want, but to my mind, they're brought to a saving faith in Yahweh. They're brought to fear the one true God. They're brought to honor him with sacrifice, to dedicate themselves somehow to him through vows because of Jonah. Not faithful evangelizing Jonah, who went down the ship in Joppa, went down the port in Joppa and gave everyone a tract before heading off to Nineveh. No, it was disobedient runaway Jonah, the man who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He's the one whom God used to speak to the Phoenician pagans, because salvation is of the Lord. And then Jonah goes to Nineveh. Weeks of traveling across the dry land, because the great fish probably doesn't swim up rivers for hundreds of miles to deliver him there. And finally, the stinking speaker arrives at his destination, and he's got a message of condemnation. There is no hope found in his words in chapter 3, verse 4. Yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. What a great message for Jonah. It would have appealed to him, that message. He's probably a proud nationalist. And it's a message to the great enemies of his people, a message seemingly of destruction. Imagine in August 1940. Great Britain is the last country fighting. Mainland Europe is under fascist rule. The RAF is struggling to hold back the greater numbers of the Luftwaffe. It's reaching the height of the Battle of Britain. And then imagine, in that point, God gives a message of the overthrow of Nazi Germany. How glorious! Our enemy is going to be defeated, his kingdom brought low, his plans and purposes ended. Take that feeling, there's something similar here. These people in Nineveh, they're not friendly trading Phoenicians. They are arrogant Assyrians, nasty Ninevites, a people who are given to violence and to bloodshed. And Jonah may have quite enjoyed a message of condemnation and open rebuke. The worst they can do to him is kill him. And he honestly, you read through the whole book, he seems to set relatively little value on his own life. There's no hope in those words. Maybe he says other words, but the words of Jonah hold out no hope. But the person of Jonah is a different story. Remember, in 2 Kings 14, he prophesied God's blessing to unfaithful Israel. Perhaps he himself is bleached and stinking from the stomach acids of his transportation device. He's a living example that God is patient, that God is long-suffering, that God is forgiving of the disobedient, even kind to the disobedient. In Jonah, even if not in his words as we have them recorded, but in the person of Jonah is a message of God, that God is forgiving. The Ninevites, including their king, for some reason hold on to this faint hope and call out to God. Salvation is not of Jonah. If it was, no one in Nineveh would be saved. Jonah wouldn't have wanted that. Salvation is of the Lord. A violent and pagan people are saved. Nineveh is overthrown, but not in destruction, but rather in deliverance. Grace is poured out upon a wicked people, and the kindness of God is displayed to those who have previously been so cruel. Salvation is of the Lord. No Israelite army could have seen this victory. Jonah himself did not want to see this blessing, but it came anyway from the hand of God, for the glory of God, in accord with the plans and purposes of God. At no time did God strip away the autonomy of people, but he sovereignly worked in all things to bring about his purposes. Blessing on the sailors, blessing on Jonah, blessing on Nineveh. Even the cattle of Nineveh experienced his compassion and his mercies. Jonah is angry and bitter and resentful. And Jonah chapter 4 tells us why he ran in the first place. Because he feared this very thing, a gracious and patient God, who's patient with his people, with his servants, even with his enemies. Jonah goes to wait to see if God's judgment will come after all. Perhaps the Ninevites will quickly backslide. Well, there are valuable lessons. The God who in chapter 1, verse 17 provides or prepares a great fish, now he provides a plant, he provides a worm, he provides a vehement east wind. He's working out all of his plans his way to work out his purposes. His ultimate purpose is to save and to rescue, because salvation is of the Lord. Sailors saved, and Jonah saved, and Nineveh saved. And perhaps Jonah saved a second time. A failing believer. He's been used in the past, then he's fallen away, and then he's been restored, then he falls once more. And in Jonah chapter 4, God speaks graciously and patiently to his petulant prophet. Now, there is no place for bitterness in those who have received grace. Rather, that which we have tasted, we must share with others. Like in the parable of the prodigal son, which has a number of parallels with this Old Testament book. You know how that parable ends with an unresolved question. What will happen with the self-righteous one who is opposed to grace being demonstrated? It's a wonderful message of hope for the Christian who has failed and failed again. That God does not give up on Jonah. That God appeals to Jonah. That God reaches out to Jonah and, well, is there a resolution for Jonah? I argued with Dave Cox that there was a resolution, but you'll have to ask me about that later. There's still hope. There is hope for all sorts of people because salvation is of the Lord. There's hope for you tonight because salvation is of the Lord. As I looked up this word salvation and its 77 different uses, I saw, I can't read Hebrew, but I could see they'd sounded out the word salvation, Yeshua. And I thought, I recognize that word. Salvation, Yeshua, is of the Lord. The provision of God for sinners, for failures, for both friendly idolaters and cruel pagans, and petulant believers and repeated backsliders. Well, God provides Jesus. That's an anglicized version of Yeshua. Jesus of Nazareth. That's a little village in the north of Israel. It's only about 2.5 miles from the village of Gath-hepher. Jesus who goes to a people who are in need. Jesus who brings a full and final salvation. Jesus who descends from heaven to the depths of this world, who, as it were, disappears into the depths of death, coming up again in victory. Jesus who dies, disappearing from the world of the living, that in his reappearing, he might bring overwhelming deliverance and everlasting prosperity. Jonah runs from God. He runs in disobedience. For Jesus, his very meat, that which sustains him, is to do the Father's will. Where Jonah complains, in the garden, Jesus says, "Not my will, but yours be done." Jesus is your only hope, both now and always. This morning we heard about looking to Jesus, illustrated from that snake on a pole from Numbers chapter 21. And the last words I think I wrote down from the sermon this morning was the need to look to Jesus every day of your life. Well, forgive me for plagiarism. I'll say the same again. Christian, no matter your struggles and your backsliding and your failure and the things you fail in today that you failed in before and you repented and you restored and now you failed again, salvation is of the Lord. Look to Jesus every day of your life. If you're backslidden, Jesus, Yeshua, salvation is of the Lord. Cling to him, look to him, trust in him. And then as we are looking to him, may we have this right attitude that says there are others who need to hear of him. And sometimes they will hear of him through our witness, even when we're walking in disobedience. That's not as it should be, but God is sovereign because salvation is of the Lord. But how much more wonderful it is to be cooperating with that which God has commanded, to go and speak to lost souls and speak of the salvation God has provided, that the world might hear of the Savior and turn to him in faith. As we close this portion of the service, before we come to the table, we're going to sing of where our hope is. 557. Not what these hands have done can save this guilty soul. Not what this toiling flesh has borne can make my spirit whole. And we go through that, and then it speaks of where our hope is. Let's enjoy finding it together in 557.